Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki Jai Om Vishnupada Paramahamsa Parivarajakacarya Ashtotra Shata Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada ki Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda ki Namacharya Haridas Thakur ki प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासुदि गौर भक्तवृंद की श्री श्री राधा कृष्ण गोप गोपीनाथ श्याम कुंड राधा कुंड गिरि गोवर्धन की वृंदावन मथुरा धाम की नवद्वीप मायपुर धाम की जगन्नाथपुरी धाम की गंगा माई यमुना माई की भक्ति देवी तुलसी महारानी की समवेत भक्तवृंद की गौर प्रेमानंदे. All glories to the simple devotees, all glories to the simple devotees, all glories to the simple devotees, all glories to Shri Guru and Gauranga Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada ki. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudiraye Nashtaprayeshu Abhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtiki. So today we are reading from Srimad Bhāgavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 25, verse number 2. Jñānaṁ niḥśreyasa-arthāya. Jñānaṁ niḥśreyasa-arthāya. Puruṣasyātma-darśanam. Puruṣasyātma-darśanam. Yad āhur varṇate tatte. Yad āhur varṇaye tatte. hṛdaya-granthi-bhedanam. hṛdaya-granthi-bhedanam. jñānaṁ niḥśreyasārthāya. puruṣasyātma-darśanam. Yad āhur varṇate tatte. hṛdaya-granthi-bhedanam. jñānaṁ niḥśreyasārthāya. puruṣasyātma-darśanam. Yad āhur varṇaye tatte. hṛdaya-granthi-bhedanam. Jñānaṁ niḥśreyasārthāya. puruṣasyātma-darśanam. Yad āhur varṇaye tatte. hṛdaya-granthi-bhedanam. Jñānaṁ niḥśreyasārthāya. puruṣasyātma-darśanam. Yad āhur varṇate tatte. hṛdaya-granthi-bhedanam. puruṣasyātma-darśanam. Yad āhur varṇaye tatte. hṛdaya-granthi-bhedanam. Jñānaṁ, knowledge. Niḥśreyasārthāya, for the ultimate perfection. Puruṣasya, of a man. ātma-darśanam, self-realization. Yet, which. āhuḥ, they said. varṇaye, I shall explain. Tat, that. te, to you, hṛdaya, in the heart, granthi, the knots, bhedanam, cuts. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki Jai. Translation: knowledge is the ultimate perfection of self-realization. I shall explain that knowledge unto you, by which the knots of attachment to the material world are cut. Let's repeat together. Knowledge is the ultimate perfection of self-realization. I shall explain that knowledge unto you, by which the knots of attachment to the material world are cut. Purport: it is said that by proper understanding of the pure self, or by self-realization, one can be freed from material attachment. Knowledge leads one to attain the ultimate perfection of life and to see oneself as he is. The Śvetāśvatara Upaniṣad 3.8 also confirms this. Tam eva viditvāti mṛtyum eti. Simply by understanding one's constitutional position or seeing oneself as he is, one can be freed from material entanglement. In various ways, the seeing of oneself is described in the Vedic literature, and it is confirmed in Bhāgavatam, puruṣasya ātma-darśanam, that one has to see oneself and know what he is. As Kapiladeva explains to his mother, this seeing can be done by hearing from proper authoritative source. Kapiladeva is the greatest authority because he is the personality of Godhead, and if someone accepts whatever is explained as it is without interpretation, then he can see himself. Lord Chaitanya explained to Sanatana Goswami the real constitutional position of the individual. He said directly that each and every individual soul is eternally a servitor of Krishna. Jivar Swarup Hoy Krishnera Nityadas. Every individual soul is eternally a servitor. When one is fixed in the understanding that he is a part and parcel of the Supreme Soul and that his eternal position is to serve in association with the Supreme Lord, he becomes self-realized. This position of rightly understanding oneself cuts the knot of material attachment, hṛdaya-granthi-bhedanam. Due to false ego or false identification of oneself with the body and material world, one is entrapped by Maya. But as soon as one understands that he is qualitatively the same substance as Supreme Lord, because he belongs to the same category of spirit soul, and that his perpetual position is to serve, one attains ātma-darśanam and hṛdaya-granthi-bhedanam, self-realization. When one can cut the knot of attachment to the material world, his understanding is called knowledge. ātma-darśanam means to see oneself by knowledge. Therefore, when one is freed from false ego by the cultivation of real knowledge, he sees himself, and that is the ultimate necessity of human life. The soul is thus isolated from the entanglement of 24 categories of material nature. Pursuit of the systematic philosophical process called Sankhya is called knowledge and self-revelation. Thus ends the purport. Om ajñānatimirandasya jñānaṁ chakshur unmilitam ena tasmai Shri Gurave namaha Shri Chaitanya manobishtam sthapitam yena bhutale swayam rupa kadamayam dadati swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Utapadakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lilita Shri Vishakanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindubhya evacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shrivasati Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So welcome all for today's Srimad Bhagavatam class. So we are on chapter 25, verse number 2. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's correct. And verse number 2. So the translation is, knowledge is the ultimate perfection of self-realization. I shall explain that knowledge unto you by which the knots of attachment to the material world are cut. So in the purport also, we can see the main emphasis is basically on knowledge and how one has to acquire knowledge, what is knowledge, and what happens when one acquires that knowledge, right? So, basically, this Sankhya philosophy is presented by Lord Kapila, who is the son of Mother Devahuti. So, if you look at both the Sankhya philosophies, either atheistic Sankhya philosophy or theistic Sankhya philosophy, there is some common things, but at the same time there are some differences. So, in both the Sankhya philosophies, they do accept that there is Purusha and there is Prakriti. But however, in the atheistic Sankhya philosophy, the cause of suffering is basically ascribed to the lack of discrimination between Purusha and Prakriti. Because the individual living entity, because is not able to discriminate between what is permanent and what is temporary, and not able to discriminate what is knowledge and what is ignorance, so that is a cause of suffering. And if you look at theistic Sankhya philosophy also, here also the cause of suffering is more or less the same. The cause of suffering is basically ascribed to the entanglement of the living entity in the three modes of nature. Because the living entity is entangled in three modes of nature, the individual living soul is bewildered, and that is the cause of one's suffering. But if you look at the atheistic Sankhya, what is the solution then? The solution is obvious. Now that you do not have knowledge, that is the reason why you are suffering, then obviously the solution is try to understand analytically what is the difference between Purusha and Prakriti, and this is done by analytical study of the 24 elements of nature, and that is what it is described as knowledge. But if you look at the theistic Sankhya philosophy, which is presented here in the Bhagavatam, here also it is the analytical understanding of the material nature is also there, but along with that there is one additional item. What is that one additional item? The additional thing is that it is also emphasized on surrendering to the Lord. So both are there, both has to go together. That is why if we look at Bhakti Yoga process also, in the Bhakti Yoga process, the main emphasis is actually given on surrender, right? Principles of surrender, as Krishna also explains in Bhagavad Gita, that sarva dharman parityajam and all those shlokas. But if you look at on the other side, or the Jnana Yogis or impersonalists, their main focus or their main emphasis is actually on analytical understanding of the material nature. And by such understanding, they believe that they can achieve liberation. So, either analytical understanding or without analytical understanding, but what are we trying to achieve? What we are trying to achieve as a devotee? See, as a devotee, our thing basically is to surrender to the Lord, right? And to strengthen our faith. So, now, how this faith is strengthened, there are different ways. Of course, one way of strengthening the faith is by understanding how we are not this body, but we are spirit soul, and how, analytically understanding how we are not this body. That is also a kind of Sankhya philosophy. So that is one way how we can strengthen our faith so that we can surrender more to the Lord. But on the other side, atheistic Sankhya philosophers, they basically only focus on analytical understanding and not so much upon surrendering to the Lord. Because if you see what is the root cause of suffering, the root cause of suffering, what is it? It is basically avidya. It is ignorance. As it is explained in the 11th canto of Bhagavatam, anadi avidya yuktasya puruṣasyātma-darśanam means because a person who has been covered by ignorance since time immemorial is not capable of effecting his own self-realization. So the root cause of all problem is basically avidya, means ignorance. Now the obvious question is, how do we get rid of avidya? That is why the shloka further explains, Shvatona sambhavat anyas tattvajño jñānado bhavet. Means that's why we must be some other personality who is in factual knowledge. Who is that person? It is your guru, right? So through guru, one acquires this divine knowledge and the knowledge of absolute truth and can impart this knowledge onto him. So in this way, basically, avidya is the root cause of the problem, and the solution is obviously acquiring this divine knowledge. Now the question is, what is knowledge? Right? This is a very, very basic question. So what is knowledge? Of course, knowledge in this context of what we are discussing here, what is knowledge and how knowledge is different from surrender. See, if you see, I explained two things, right? One is how the atheistic Sankhya philosophers, they emphasize more on knowledge. Even the Jnana Yogis, they emphasize more on knowledge. But on the other side, the Bhakti Yoga, we emphasize more on surrender, Sharanagati. So then why is it that, knowledge given so much importance, and how is it different from surrender? Is my question clear? So the first question, so what is knowledge? Actually, it is given in this purport itself. Prabhupada mentions that when one can cut the knot of attachment to the material world, his understanding is called knowledge. You see, this is one way of defining knowledge. Like, this is like saying the one which tastes sweet is called sugar. I mean, just telling by the quality, defining a substance by its quality. Like, the one which can cut the knot of attachment to the material world is called as knowledge. This is one way of defining what knowledge is. And of course, there is one more statement in the purport. The pursuit of systematic philosophical process is called Sankhya, is called knowledge and self-revelation. So this is one more definition how knowledge is defined. Of course, there are many more definitions how knowledge is defined. Does anyone have any other definition of knowledge? Does anyone remember any other definition? In the 14th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, there is a definition of knowledge. Does anyone remember? So, kshetrajñāṁ chāpimāṁ viddhi sarva kshetreshu bharata kshetra kshetrajñor jñānaṁ tat yatta jñānam matam mama. So this is how Krishna defines what is knowledge. Means he says, no, it is in 13th chapter, not 14th chapter. So there he says, O scion of Bharata, you should understand that I am also the knower in all bodies. And to understand this body and its knower is called as knowledge. So this is a definition of knowledge which is given by Krishna in Bhagavad Gita, where he says, Kshetra kshetrajñor jñānam. What is jñānam? Jñānam basically means understanding of what is kshetra. Kshetra means the field of activities or this body. And kshetrajña. Of course, kshetrajña has two meanings. One is the soul, in living entity, and also kshetrajña can also means the Paramatma. So in this way, basically knowledge means three things. What are those three things? Understanding this kshetra, body, and understanding what is living entity, and understanding what is the Lord, Ishvara. So all these three put together is called as knowledge. So that is how Krishna defines knowledge in Bhagavad Gita. Okay? So if we just look at this knowledge, if we just see how typically knowledge is understood, like if you just look at a dictionary definition of knowledge, how is knowledge defined? Knowledge basically means, this is how it typically is defined in the dictionary, it basically means facts, information, skills acquired by a person through experience or education or a theoretical or practical understanding of a subject. So this is how actually a knowledge is defined. But actually this knowledge, this definition of knowledge is actually not very comprehensive or not very perfect. Or this is lack of knowledge of understanding what is knowledge, or you can put in that way. So the actual definition of knowledge is actually threefold. So knowledge basically always has three things in it. It has a subject, it has object, and it has relationship between those three things. So only when you understand these three things, then that is called as jñānaṁ. Jñānam is very different from knowledge. Knowledge is just a shallow understanding of some object. Okay, now you have an orange. Orange is orange color and it is round in shape. That is also knowledge, but that's not a full knowledge. Knowledge basically has three things: subject, object, and relationship. For example, I'll give a small example. So let's say that a person is in coma. Like, he's in coma. He's not aware of what's happening around him for, let's say, for 10 years. And let's say this person comes out of the coma and then he sees an iPad next to him, right? I mean, 10 years before, there's no iPad, right? I mean, right? So when this person comes out of the coma and then sees his iPad, I mean, he can see that, there's an object, it has a screen, it has some buttons, he can understand what it is, right? But can he really understand what it is, like how to use it? No, he doesn't understand, right? So, of course, someone has to come and explain, oh, this is iPad. iPad is like a mini version of a computer. It does everything what a computer does. So he has to give some knowledge, how to use it, right? So then he understands, oh, okay, now I understand what iPad is, right? So what are there here? There are three things. One is a person who is trying to understand what is iPad, and the object is the iPad, and the relationship means how to use iPad and that knowledge. So only when you understand these three things together, then that is perfect or complete knowledge. So in this way, this relationship is actually also called as sambandha jnana. Sambandha jnana basically means what is that relationship between the subject and the object you are trying to understand. This sambandha jnana is actually very, very important. So unless you really understand sambandha jnana, I mean, there's no use of just knowing iPad, just knowing that you are the person. There's no use of it, right? There's no like actual, utility of such knowledge. So in this way, the knowledge has three aspects. If we dive even further into what exactly jñānaṁ means, what is jñānaṁ? Jñānaṁ actually comes from the root word called jñā avabodhane, means to know. To know is actually called as jñānaṁ. And this jñānaṁ actually, depending upon the context which this word is used, it can actually have three meanings. One meaning is that jñāpita jñānaṁ. Jñāpita jñānaṁ means ability to understand, right? You understand what ability to understand means. For example, you see an animal. Can animal understand everything? No, it can understand some things, but it is very limited. Can animal understand the scriptures, the Vedas? No, it cannot understand, right? So that is also that's a limitation of jñānaṁ. Even though it's having jñānaṁ, but it's limited. So that ability to understand is also called as jñānaṁ, jñāpita jñānaṁ. And basically the other one is jñānate anena iti jñānaṁ, means understanding the object. Let's say I give you something, let's say I give an iPad, right? So you're trying to analyze what iPad is, how it looks, what is its color, what is its shape, what are the buttons, what are the features. Those are like the knowledge of the object. That is also knowledge. But now, who is understanding this knowledge? That's the third one, right? This is called consciousness. So this is a big mystery. Actually, scientists, this is where scientists are struggling to understand what is consciousness. So now you can understand, okay, I am the knower and this is the object I'm trying to understand. But who is that who is trying to understand? Or when I say I am feeling pain, who is that person who is feeling the pain? Right? So that's a conscious studies. So this is something which a lot of people struggle to understand, or even the scientific knowledge struggle to understand, is the third aspect of jñānaṁ, means who is the knower? Who is a person who is possessing that knowledge? That is called as jñānaṁ asti asminiti. So, now coming back to the definition of knowledge, this knowledge basically, see, in the school every day, basically we primarily deal with the second phase of knowledge, basically, which is actually as an object. We are always trying to understand, what is this, what is that, what is it, what is its qualities. It's all like the knowledge of the object is what mainly we're always focused in everyday life. But now what is the difference between the material knowledge and spiritual knowledge? Right? So the material knowledge is something which always reveals the meaning of objects which is outside you. Like this is a table, this is a mic, this is a person, this is a boy, this is a girl, this is a chair. Those are all like external knowledge. But spiritual knowledge is something which reveals oneself. See, that is the difference between material knowledge and spiritual knowledge. You see, that is why in the purport, if you see, as soon as one understands that he is qualitatively same substance as the Supreme Lord, because he belongs to the same category of spirit soul, and that his perpetual position is to serve, one attains ātma-darśanam. You see, this is also darshanam, this is also knowledge. But this knowledge which reveals oneself, not outside, inside, you see, that knowledge which reveals oneself is called as ātma-darśanam. So that is the difference between a spiritual knowledge and material knowledge. That is why, basically, out of all three features of knowledge, the most important thing is actually sambandha jnana. Sambandha jnana means what is the relationship. That is the most important thing. And that is the most important thing. That is why even in Bhagavad Gita also, in the 4th chapter, when Krishna says yoga nashta parantapa, right, means this yoga system is lost. What do you mean by lost? I mean, it's already there, right? I mean, 5,000 years ago, there are so many great personalities, great sages, everybody's living, and there is Vedic literature available. So what do you mean by knowledge is lost? So what is lost is actually not the knowledge itself, but what is lost is the sambandha jnana. What is this relationship between the soul and the super soul? You see, that is why Prabhupada translates the word yogaha in this Bhagavad Gita verse as a science of one's relationship with the Supreme. So what is actually lost is actually this relationship or the sambandha jnana. That is the most important thing. Out of all the three aspects of jnana, the most important is sambandha jnana. That is why, even though Krishna defines jnana as actually kshetra-kshetrajño jñānaṁ, means the knowledge of body and its knower, but however, in the upcoming verses in the same 13th chapter, he gives one more definition of jnana, knowledge. What does he say? He says, amanitvam, adambitvam, ahimsa, shantir, arjavam, so on. Like he kind of lists so many qualities. And towards the end, he says that this is called knowledge. You see? Humility, pridelessness, non-violence, tolerance, all these so many qualities. And at the end, he says that all this I declare to be knowledge. Now, how is this different from the previous definition of knowledge given by Krishna? See, the thing is that knowledge doesn't mean some theoretical understanding of one thing. No, knowledge actually means practice. You have to practice, right? So, what is practice? The humility, pridelessness, non-violence, all these things are important. Because we see many scholars. There are so many scholars who understands Bhagavad Gita, who memorizes all the shlokas. They can tell you from front to back, back to front, everything. Like they memorize everything. But however, they're not very God conscious. You see? So it is not just some theoretical understanding is called knowledge, but it's actually practical implementation. That is why in the purport for this verse, Prabhupada says in the purport, this process of knowledge, sometimes misunderstood by less intelligent people as being interaction of the field of activity. But actually, this is a real process of knowledge. If one accepts this process, then the possibility of approaching the spiritual truth exists. It is not the interaction of 24 elements as described before. What is before? The third verse. Because kshetra kshetrajño jñānaṁ. It is actually the means to get out of the entanglement out of these elements is actually called jñānam. You see? The real jñānam basically means how do we come out of these entanglements? How do we come out of these three modes of nature, being entangled in these three modes of nature? So that is the real knowledge. You see? So that is basically sambandha jnana. And even in this current purport also, in the Prabhupada mentions, Lord Chaitanya explained to Sanatana Goswami the real constitutional position of the individual. He said directly that each and every individual soul is eternally a servitor of Krishna. Jivar Swarup Hoy, Krishnera Nityadas. Every individual soul is eternally a servitor. When one is fixed in the understanding of that he is a part and parcel of Supreme Lord, Supreme Soul, and that his eternal position is to serve in association with the Supreme Lord, he becomes self-realized. You see, this is the process. See, jñānam basically leads to self-realization or to liberation. But what that knowledge is, just a theoretical understanding of some object does not lead to liberation. No. Liberation basically leads from that knowledge, and from that knowledge a person knows how to engage oneself in the service of Krishna, how to engage in devotional service. Only that kind of knowledge is actually perfection of knowledge, and only that can give liberation to a person. A simple theoretical understanding cannot give liberation. So, active engagement is always required. So now coming back to our second question which we asked. Now what is the difference between the knowledge and surrender? Because how is knowledge different from surrender? We see two different shlokas, right? Once there are some verses which kind of stresses on knowledge, and there are some verses which kind of stresses on sharanagati, which on surrender. So now the question is, are these things two different independent things, or are these two things kind of related to each other? If they're related, how they're related to each other? Can anyone explain? Like what is the relationship, that how is knowledge different from surrender? Anyone likes to try? See, generally when we say surrender, People generally think that surrender basically means that I have to go and fall at the feet of somebody, say that I'm surrendered, or just go and catch the Lord's feet and say that I'm surrendered. This is called surrender. No, actually that is not a full understanding of surrender. Surrender basically means, that is basically called as adhyavasayatmika jnana. What it means is that having confidence that Lord Krishna will protect me. You see, that is called surrender. See, surrender is basically not different from knowledge. Surrender is also a type of knowledge. You see, surrender is not something different from knowledge. Surrender is also a type of knowledge. Or surrender is something which comes from knowledge or understanding Krishna's position. Surrender automatically comes. Does anyone remember how surrender is defined in Chaitanya Charitamrita? The 6 aspects of surrender. Does anyone remember that verse from Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhya Leela? No? Anukulyasa sankalpa, pratikulyasa varjanam, rakshasyasi vishvaso, gopatritve varnanam katata, atma-nikshepa karpanye, shadvida sharanagatihi. So this is how sharanagati, surrender is defined. What is the first one? Anukulyasa sankalpa. What is anukulyasa sankalpa? What does it mean? That means accepting things that are favorable to one's devotional service. What is the next one? Pratikulyasya varjanam. What does it mean? Rejecting things which are not favorable. And rakshayasyasi vishvaso means, what does it mean? Basically means one is convinced of Krishna's protection, that Krishna will always protect me. That conviction should be there. What is the next one? Gopetrar varnanam tata. What does it mean? It means accept the Lord as one's master. And atma-nikshepa. What does it mean? Surrender. Means basically surrender. What does surrender means? Basically realizing that or understanding that one's desires and activities are not independent. That one is always working under the direction of Krishna. And what's the last one? Karpanye. Basically it means that meek and humble. So you see, this is how Sharanagati or surrender is defined. So this surrender basically is not something which is different from knowledge. You see? See, one has to be convinced. What has to be convinced of what? One has to be convinced that Krishna is always one's protector, and one should be always having that knowledge through which one should reject things which are not favorable to bhakti and accept things which are favorable to bhakti. You see, this is also a knowledge. You see, surrender is also a type of knowledge. So in this way, only when one has this complete knowledge of both theoretical understanding of something and also how to practically use that knowledge so that one can come out of that, of this bondage of 3 modes of nature and achieve liberation, then that knowledge is something which will give you liberation. So that is why in today's translation of this shloka, basically it says, knowledge is the ultimate perfection of self-realization. I shall explain that knowledge unto you by which the knots of attachment to the material world are cut. And Prabhupada explains in the purport that knowledge basically means that thing which one is able to cut the knots of attachment. If you're not able to cut the knots of attachment with whatever knowledge you're having, that means that your knowledge either is imperfect or incomplete. So that is ultimate purpose, or the need, the effect of acquiring this divine transcendental knowledge. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, so we'll end the class here. Then Srimad Bhāgavatam ki jai. Jagadishwara Prabhupada ki jai.